What's up YouTube? How's it going? In today's video, we're actually having a look at a product we have previously reviewed. Plot twist, this time it has a Ryzen 4800H processor, and that's the Acer Nitro 5 right here. I definitely think this guy is different enough to warrant its own dedicated review, and I think you're going to enjoy it because it brings a number of new features to the table, including a refreshed design. So as always guys, if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing to my channel and liking this video. Let's get started. In terms of raw specifications, the Acer Nitro 5 is a pretty decent powerhouse. So you basically have a 8-core 4800H Ryzen 7 processor. You also have 16GB of DDR4 RAM, which is twice as much as you get with the base configuration. Additionally, you also have the GTX 1650 Ti variant with 4GB of VRAM, and you do also have a 512GB solid-state drive. Furthermore, you also have the latest Wi-Fi 6 standard along with Bluetooth built right in, and of course you have a full HD display with a 144Hz refresh rate. In terms of what comes with the box itself is a pretty generic looking cardboard box. You do have the Nitro 5 labeling in the dead center. Also, you have some cool graphics on the box because obviously this is a gaming laptop, so fair advertising. Once you remove the content seal and unhook the cardboard hinges, you can actually open up the box, and inside of course you have the Nitro 5 laptop, which is pretty neatly packed, but we'll get back to that in just a second. You'll also have a black box. Inside this box you have a generic looking wall outlet plug charger cable. You also have a SATA extension should you want to add additional hard drives, and of course you also have the screws to plug that in internally. And lastly, you have a 135-watt charging brick. This is about the same as the base configuration, and it's ample power to power a Ryzen processor. Too bad Intel can't say the same. Let's talk body design and language. So this variation of the Nitro 5 gaming laptop weighs exactly 5.3 pounds, which is moderately heavy for a gaming laptop, but it's not super heavy by any means. Also, it's worth noting, similar to its predecessors, this variant also uses a full TPU build, so if you are someone who's big on metal enclosures, you won't find that here. Starting off with the top side of the laptop, so right in between you have your Acer branding. Also, it's worth noting the center part of the top side actually has a very smooth and flat texture. However, as you go further on, you'll notice there's two grooves on either side, and they actually go inwards that create a nice aggressive styling. Beyond those grooves, you actually have a rough texture on the outer side of the top side. Also, you'll see two lines that go towards the center rear side, and of course as soon as you get towards the end on the rear side, you have the Nitro branding right there as well. As you move on to the rear side, I'm personally a really big fan of Acer's choice of styling over here. Those two exhaust vents on either side have a really aggressive look to them, and that's where all the hot air comes out from. It looks like they're gonna breathe fire. They shouldn't be doing that, by the way. You might want to contact support if that happens. All jokes aside, it's also worth noting you have a DC jack in the center point of the rear side, so charging happens from the back side. Speaking of sides, it's worth noting you have a decent variety of I/O ports, not as robust as some other competitors, but here's what you get. You basically get two USB 3.0 ports on one side, you have an Ethernet jack, and of course your good old headphone jack. On the other side, you have an additional USB 3.0 port that actually offers reverse charging if you want to charge, let's say, your phone. You also have a full-sized HDMI port, and of course you have a USB-C port. It's also worth noting that on either side you actually have active air intake vents where the cool air enters the laptop. Finally, as we make our way to the bottom of the laptop, you'll notice there's more TPU, but you do have lots of passive air intake vents. It's also worth noting you actually have two cooling fans on this laptop, so you should have ample cooling. Aside from that, you have your basic rubber grips to keep the laptop in place. If you look carefully towards the outer edges of the bottom side, you have two speaker grills, one on either side, and this is a stereo speaker setup, so sound quality should be decent at the very least. As soon as you open up the laptop, you'll notice a number of things. First and foremost, you'll notice you have a reasonable amount of palm rest space. Obviously, you have lots of branding, both from Nvidia, from Ryzen, and also just Acer's own branding on the side advertising their product. One thing you'll notice is that the trackpad is pretty reasonable in terms of its size. One problem I do have with the trackpad is that often it feels flimsy, so if you apply pressure to click left or right, the entire trackpad tends to lift towards the direction you're applying pressure to. You can tell that quality wasn't the biggest priority when designing this trackpad for Acer. On the flip side, as we get towards the keyboard, I always like the Nitro 5 series keyboards. I think they're pretty comfortable. You have a decent 1.5mm travel, you get good feedback, the keys feel nice and tactile. but never too dominating or too clicky by nature. I think for gaming, this is a great experience. Also, I think if you're writing essays on this thing or occasionally coding on it, you'll have a pretty comfortable typing experience. You'll also have a dedicated 10-key number pad for you Excel-loving number crunchers out there. And lastly, it's worth noting that the keyboard is fully backlit. It's not RGB, unfortunately. It only lights up in a red tone, which goes nicely with the Nitro theme in general. Some additional things to note about the laptop keyboard is the fact that both the WASD keys and the arrow keys have a nice red outline around them. This is obviously because this is a gaming laptop. Also, it's worth noting that the arrow keys are just as big as the rest of the keys on the keyboard. This is great because I was worried that Acer might shrink them to accommodate the 10-key pad, but that's not the case, thankfully. Unfortunately, there is no dedicated media key bar, which means all the media keys and function keys are actually integrated together with the traditional function key line that you find on your laptop. Also, the power button is towards the number pad key and it's kind of mixing with the keyboard. I'm a fan of having a dedicated power button outside of the keyboard, but that's just an aesthetics thing. There's no problem in terms of usage. As you move past the keyboard itself, you'll notice that you have a pretty nice and large hinge bar on either side. So the hinge is pretty durable on the Nitro 5. As long as you treat it with decent caution, you should have it last for the years to come. Also, in the middle of the hinge bar, you have two indicator lights. One of these is to indicate the battery charging, and of course the other one is to indicate SSD activity. The bezels around the display are relatively thin and they definitely meet 2020 standards. You do have a fairly fat chin at the bottom, but it's nothing out of the ordinary, and that is often expected with gaming laptops. Also, on the top side, you have a 720p webcam, which isn't the best in quality, but at least Acer opted to include it. Some other competitors like Asus with their G15 and G17 series don't even include a webcam at all. Let's talk about the display itself. So I have mixed feelings about the display on this laptop, to be honest. On one side, you have pretty good specs, like you have a standard FHD 1080p screen with a reasonable 141 ppi. Also, you have a nice 144 Hz refresh rate, which is nice for gaming. But then on the other side, you have really poor color accuracy. I'm talking 61% sRGB, which is pretty low if we're being honest. And if you're going to be doing video, photo editing, color grading, or anything of that nature, you may want to reconsider this laptop, or at least consider getting an external display for sure. Aside from that, you do have a peak brightness of 271 nits. It's bright, but in my opinion, anything below 300 nits is often not bright enough for bright settings, such as when the sunlight might be partially facing your screen, so keep that in mind as well. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room, performance. So when you spend money on a Ryzen 7 4800H 8-core processor, you better get good performance. I'm happy to say that is exactly the case here for the most part. So starting off with day-to-day activities like web browsing, maybe having a Word document open, or anything of that nature, this thing will plow right through it, like most laptops would. But what makes it really impressive is the multitasking capability. You can have tons and tons of Google Chrome tabs open. You can also have stuff running in the background. You can even have a little bit of editing going on while rendering is happening on, and the Ryzen 7 does a pretty good job of handling all of that. Also, that additional 8GB of RAM, making a total of 16GB, really helps because you have the capacity to carry all those tasks at the same time. Finally, we come to the sole reason you're probably buying this laptop in the first place: gaming performance. I'm also happy to say, for the most part, gaming is pretty pleasurable on this laptop. You'll usually hit 60+ FPS on relatively high settings, and in some modern AAA titles, you can even hit the ultra high or highest settings and still hit close to or around 60 FPS. One big limitation you'll notice right away is the 1650 Ti itself. The graphics card isn't bad, don't get me wrong, but it is a 2-generation old graphics card now, and on top of that, you only have 4GB of VRAM. So often when you're trying to max out games like, let's say, Doom Eternal, you can't, because there simply is not enough video RAM to support that. So that is a bit of a limitation, and often I find both the 4800H and the DDR4 16GB of RAM are plenty of power, but they get bottlenecked pretty severely because of 1650 Ti. In terms of temperatures, I generally found that the laptop would average anywhere between 60 to 80 degrees when you put it under high stress loads and playing modern day AAA titles, once again, like Doom Eternal. Also, for those of you who are interested in the fan noise, this is a pretty loud laptop. Even at low loads, it runs around 32 decibels in terms of the fan noise, and when you put it under high stress, it can hit all the way up to 49 decibels. so fairly loud. Once again, keep in mind this is a gaming laptop, so obviously it does prioritize keeping the laptop as cool as possible, but it never gets to the point where the laptop becomes uncomfortable to hold or the keyboard becomes too hot. It stays warm, but never out of control. Finally, we come to battery life. So battery life is all across the place for this particular variant. What I mean by that is when we did tests like general web browsing, watching a little bit of Netflix, playing some songs at 50% volume occasionally, we were able to squeeze up to 8 hours of battery life with this laptop. The lower end of that spectrum was 6 hours. However, the minute you start gaming and you put on high settings, your battery life drops quickly to around 1.5 hours, and in some cases it dropped to right about 1 hour. So like I said, depending on the task or activity you're doing, your battery life will greatly vary by several hours. Also, I want to give you guys a quick glimpse of how the speakers sound on this guy. So here's a quick sound test. Okay, so here's my verdict. Priced at $1,400 USD, the Nitro 5 is kind of pushing the line of a budget laptop, so this is probably the upper end of a budget laptop. However, if you look at all the value it's offering in terms of specifications, considering the fact you have a Ryzen 7 with 8 cores, also 16 gigabytes of RAM, you are getting a lot of horsepower. The biggest limitation I find with the Nitro 5 is the fact that you have a 1650 Ti, which will inevitably be a bottleneck for some games, especially if you want the highest graphical settings. However, with that being said, for most games you can still hit high to ultra high settings and still achieve an easy 60 plus FPS. And you'll definitely utilize the 144Hz display if you are using it for games that don't require that much graphical power. Also, the build quality of the Nitro 5 series isn't the most premium. I feel like Acer could have done a slightly better job in adding more premium components in terms of the build quality, but it's not the end of the world. And lastly, the battery life is super impressive on the Nitro 5. If you are someone who's looking for a decent gaming experience, but you don't want to spend north of $1,500, this is probably one of the best values you can get in terms of your gaming experience. Also, if you are someone who wants reasonable battery life out of a gaming laptop, the Nitro 5 does a pretty good job at that as well. All in all, I think this is a pretty well balanced laptop, and it's about as good as a budget laptop can get. Anything beyond this and you start getting into RTX territory, which is considerably more expensive. As always guys, if you enjoyed my review, if you like my content, please consider subscribing to my channel, liking this video. It helps me grow, keeps me motivated more for you guys. I'll catch you in the next one. Soul of Tech logging out.